Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Eric Osansky. He brings over 15 years of chiropractic care, functional medicine, and nutrition expertise. We're going to talk about, he's the host of a podcast himself called Save My Thyroid. Unfortunately, my thyroid is long gone, which we may talk about, may not. But again, he's a chiropractic physician. He had Graves' disease himself and is in remission. He's dedicated his career now to helping others to address thyroid and autoimmune conditions naturally. He's a self-published author of natural treatment solutions for hyperthyroidism and Graves' disease, Hashimoto's triggers. He has the hyperthyroid healing diet. So it's going to be a good call. Welcome, Eric.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, just tell me a bit about, usually the people that help people with a certain condition have had their own journey like you've had. So what happened with you and when, and what got you into helping other people with their thyroid?
Yeah, so this all happened in late 2007 is when I was dieting, detoxifying, exercising intensely, and I was losing weight, which was the goal, but I was losing a lot of weight, had increased appetite. At first, didn't realize that was tied into hyperthyroidism, but one day, I actually took my blood pressure at one of those automated blood pressure machines, and my blood pressure was fine, but it also measured my heart rate, which was around 90, and that which is not crazy high, but definitely high for really everyone and high for me. So I took my pulse manually the next few days. It was consistently elevated between 90 and 110 beats per minute. Went to a doctor and he diagnosed me with hyperthyroidism, and then eventually went to an endocrinologist, got diagnosed with Graves' disease. And being my background as a chiropractor, we tried to address the cause of the problem. At the time, I didn't have any experience specifically with hyperthyroidism, but I attended nutritional conferences, actually a few functional endocrinology conferences as part of my continuing education credits as a chiropractor. And so I decided that I was going to take a natural approach, not knowing if it would be successful. But long story short, I was able to get into remission through diet and lifestyle. And yeah, I've been helping others with not only hyperthyroidism and Graves' disease, but Hashimoto's thyroiditis as well since 2009.
So just for listeners, hyper is overactive. And from what I understand, people with Graves' disease, like their eyes will bulge a little bit. They'll have very high metabolism, maybe anxious, nervous, lose weight like crazy, can't keep it on. Hypo, again, from what I understand, gain weight, can't get it off, sluggish, tired, brain fog, etc. I'm probably sure there's a lot more. Any other major distinctions people need to know about, like, what they experience under Hashimoto's and these other conditions, just so in listening right off the bat, they can say, oh, there's information for me here that might be useful.
Yeah, I mean, what you said is accurate. I mean, of course, everybody's different. Some people with hyperthyroidism actually gain weight, but the majority will lose a lot of weight. You mentioned the thyroid eye disease, the bulging eyes, which not when I dealt with Graves, unfortunately, I didn't experience that, and not everybody does, but it is quite common with Graves. So if you're having hyperthyroidism and you're having those bulging eyes or eye swelling or double vision, that's a good sign that you have Graves. Insomnia, very common, as well as anxiety with hyperthyroidism, just because everything's revved up. So that makes people anxious. That causes sleep disturbances, increased bowel movements with hyperthyroidism, whereas with hypothyroidism Hashimoto's, like they get sluggish bowel, coldness with Hashimoto's and hypothyroidism, whereas like with people with hyperthyroidism get heat intolerance commonly. So yeah, those are some of the different ways to kind of distinguish, besides, of course, looking at the blood test. So, I mean, when you experience those symptoms, typically the person will eventually get diagnosed. But with Hashimoto's, sometimes it gets missed for a number of years, whereas typically with hyperthyroidism, it's diagnosed quicker.
Are there any poor souls that cycle back and forth between hyper and hypo?
Yeah, that does happen. There are people that have the antibodies for both Graves' disease and Hashimoto's, and they might fluctuate. They might start out as hyperthyroidism and become hypothyroid, or some people might fluctuate between hyper and hypo symptoms. More common with what's called hashitoxicosis, which is Hashimoto's with transient hyperthyroidism. And that's where someone might feel hypo one day, hyper the next day, or even the same day might get a mixture of hyper and hypo symptoms.
Oh, man. So how were you able to help yourself with Graves and with your condition? What did you start looking into? What did you realize?
Yeah, so I knew diet was important, an important piece of the puzzle. So I made diet changes. I mean, specifically back then, I followed more of a paleo diet. These days, there's also what's called an autoimmune paleo diet, which is a little bit more restrictive. And for the most part, I did okay with the paleo diet. I did hit a roadblock in my recovery, and then I decided to give up nuts and seeds for a few months, and that seemed to help. Not everybody necessarily needs to do that, but diet was important. Stress was huge. Emotional stress is big, but I mentioned that when initially, before I was diagnosed, I was dieting, detoxifying, and exercising intensely. So I was also overtraining. So that was putting a lot of stress on my body. And I did an adrenal saliva test, which showed that my adrenals were in the tank, low cortisol, low DHEA, low what's called secretory IgA, which lines the mucosa surfaces of the body. And so I worked on my diet, improved my stress handling, and just took certain supplements based on some of the imbalances, like the adrenals imbalances, had some nutrient deficiencies, vitamin D was low. So, and then also the symptom management aspect too, just we could talk about that because most people will take anti-thyroid medication, but I decided to take an herbal approach when it came to Graves' disease.
Well, people will take a So instead of, like I had papillary thyroid cancer, so I have no thyroid. So I take Synthroid, because I don't produce supposedly the T3. But people that have Graves, do they overproduce T3 or what do their labs look like? And what are some of the medications to stop them?
Exactly. So you're right. When someone has Graves' disease, typically they're overproducing thyroid hormone, T4 and T3. And so with a thyroidectomy like you received, there's no natural replacement. I mean, people could take like natural thyroid hormone, but either way, you need thyroid hormone, whether it's levothyroxine or some people will take like Armour, but there's no herbal substitute for thyroid hormone. So with hyperthyroidism, when the levels are elevated, typically the endocrinologist will give a few different options. One is anti-thyroid medication, which I'll talk about, but then also radioactive iodine, which obliterates the thyroid, and then thyroid surgery are the three options. And anti-thyroid medication examples include methimazole and PTU, which block the production of thyroid hormone. And so there's an herb, bugleweed, which I learned about when I was taking my continuing education for chiropractic. And so I learned about bugleweed, which has anti-thyroid properties, kind of like the anti-thyroid medication, not as potent. So I wasn't sure if it would work, but it actually worked great. Also took an herb called motherwort, which is like a natural beta blocker. And that worked well for me. And some people...
What about lithium orotate? That's a new one that I've seen that's supposed to help mood, but also suppresses thyroid in larger doses, supposedly.
Yeah, lithium orotate is an option. You're right, because lithium carbonate...
That's the crazy one. Dude.
Yeah, they use for depression, and they realize it causes hypothyroidism. So lithium orotate, of course, you don't need a prescription for that. So that and L-carnitine in higher doses, like 2,000 to 4,000 milligrams, can block the entry of thyroid hormone, and also in some cases help with the excess production of thyroid hormone.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when people come to you, how do you do things differently from a traditional, thyroid clinic?
Well, just like a traditional thyroid clinic, of course, we'll do a health history, a detailed health history, but that's really where the similarity ends. I mean, I guess we'll do thyroid testing, but typically they'll already come to me diagnosed. They'll have a diagnosis of Graves' disease, for example. And so, I might recommend an updated thyroid panel, but again, a lot of times they're seeing an endocrinologist and getting updated thyroid panels through them. But I'll look at other imbalances. Like I mentioned, I was deficient in vitamin D, which is important for bone health, but also helps to modulate the immune system. So having healthy vitamin D levels is important. I'll look at nutrient deficiencies. I'll run an iron panel on everybody, look at B12, look at some inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein.
How many people come to you, though, with minimal labs? Like, one thing I've seen personally, I heard from a lot of people is like, oh, they looked at my thyroid stimulating hormone. They said it's fine, TSH, that's it. And they won't do TPOAB. They won't do reverse T3, free T3, T4, all that stuff. So do people even come to you with complete panels, or how do they come to you?
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
With Graves, it's a little bit different with Hashimoto's and Graves. So you're right. With Hashimoto's, a lot of times they just get the TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone. And the reason is because typically the treatment will be the same regardless. If someone has TPO antibodies or thyroglobulin antibodies or both of those, it's not going to change the treatment of the conventional medical doctor. With Graves, usually just because TSH is depressed doesn't mean they have Graves' disease. So actually, usually they'll at least do a free T4. They might not look at the T3, but they'll do a T4. And they usually will look at the antibodies, but not always. There's also what's called the radioactive iodine uptake test, which looks at the uptake of iodine, and sometimes I'll use that diagnostically. So you are right, Richard. They won't always we won't see all the time like TSH, T3, T4, all the different types of antibodies. Reverse T3, they never do from a conventional standpoint, although with hyperthyroidism, it's almost always elevated. So it really doesn't have a whole lot of value with those with Graves. It's more, whereas if someone has Hashimoto's, I do think it's a good idea to test for that marker.
Well, why do people come to you in the first place? What kind of care are they not getting from their practitioners that have already diagnosed them in some cases?
Yeah, great question. When they go to their primary care doctor, typically they're referred to the endocrinologist, and the endocrinologist, many times they want to jump to surgery or radioactive iodine. Many just don't want to even take the anti-thyroid medication because there's a lot of side effects associated with both methimazole and PTU. Puts a lot of stress on the liver in many cases, can cause low white blood cell count, as well as other symptoms in people. So a lot of people don't want to take the anti-thyroid medication. So that's one reason. But then many doctors, again, are aggressive and are talking about radioactive iodine, thyroid surgery, and many people don't want to go that route. To them, that's like a last resort.
Well, what are some of the, the big downsides of getting your thyroid removed or radioactive iodine, before that?
Well, the big thing with Graves, it's one thing like, in your experience, you had cancer, and definitely with cancer, a good idea when it's indicated to get the thyroid gland removed, even though I'm sure there are other functional practitioners that offer natural treatments, but I'm not one of them when it comes to cancer. But with Graves, it's autoimmune. It's an autoimmune condition. So, there's definitely a time and place for surgery, and definitely a time and place for the medication. Many people that I work with are on the medication, but again, it's not the surgery or radioactive iodine isn't doing anything to address the cost of the problem. And when someone has one autoimmune condition, they have an increased likelihood of developing other autoimmune conditions in the future. So even if someone made the choice to get radioactive iodine or thyroid surgery, they would still want to, in the case of Graves, they would still want to do things to optimize their immune system health to try to prevent other autoimmune conditions from developing.
All right. So what have you found are some natural ways to help people with Graves, Hashimoto's, etc.?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, we always initially focus on diet and lifestyle, make sure they're eating a clean, healthy diet, avoiding refined foods and sugars, unhealthy oils, fast food, and stress, again, is huge. So I encourage people to block out time for stress management, whether they're practicing meditation, yoga, or just doing some deep breathing. But just, again, being aware of the impact stress has on one's health, of course, getting sufficient sleep. And then typically we'll do some functional medicine testing. I mean, I'll do some blood testing too. Again, I'll do comprehensive blood testing because, as you said, they usually aren't doing that. Not only the thyroid panel, but they might do a basic CBC, complete blood count, metabolic panel. Many times they're not looking at any, or most of the time they're not looking at anything else. So we'll do a comprehensive blood testing, but then we'll also look at adrenals. We might do an adrenal saliva test, or there's a test called the Dutch test, which is a dried urine test that looks at the adrenals, looks at the sex hormones, the metabolism of sex hormones. Sometimes we'll do a comprehensive stool panel to see if someone has parasites or opportunistic bacteria, or markers of gut inflammation, H. pylori, toxic mold. Sometimes we'll do testing for mold. I mean, that's the challenge. There could be so many different factors, so many different triggers with both Graves and Hashimoto's that it usually does take some detective work. So that's, besides focusing on diet and lifestyle, I'm also recommending certain tests to try to find these triggers, to find these underlying imbalances. And then assuming we find the triggers and underlying imbalances, then I give recommendations to help correct them. And that involves a combination of diet, supplementation. And like I said, sometimes people do need the medication from a symptom management perspective. But again, the goal is to try to, if at all possible, address the underlying cause of the problem, which many times we can do.
What about people that are on, levothyroxine, Synthroid? From what I've heard, they need management sometimes too. Like someone will tolerate, levo for a number of years and then not anymore. Their conversion is off from T4 to T3, or their conversion is too good. Do you help people with, those kind of problems with their thyroid as well, help balance them out better?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like if someone is on, in the case like you mentioned, like levothyroxine. Now, again, I don't have prescribing rights, so I can't tell the person I can't specifically tell them what to do. So I would refer them back to the primary care doctor with my opinion, like say maybe you need to go back to the prescribing doctor, have them increase the dose or decrease the dose of the levothyroxine. I mean, some people also do better on desiccated thyroid, such as like Armour or NP thyroid. But yeah, without question, I mean, people with Hashimoto's, again, it's different with Graves because the goal is to get them to the point where they don't need the anti-thyroid medication. So whereas with Hashimoto's, again, some people are able to get off the thyroid hormone replacement, but there are people who definitely need to be on thyroid hormone replacement long term. And you're right, if they need adjustments, that's when we look at the thyroid panel, also consider their symptoms. And if they're swinging more towards the hyper side, then that's indicating maybe they're taking too much levothyroxine. If it's the opposite, where they're more hypo, maybe they need to have the dose increase. And with the conversion of T4 to T3, if we see like healthy T4 levels, lower T3 levels, for example, maybe elevated reverse T3 levels, then we need to try to address that cause of the conversion. Most of the conversion, approximately 60%, takes place in the liver, and approximately 20% takes place in the gut. Stress, high cortisol can also affect that conversion. So help improve the health of the liver, the gut, the adrenals can greatly help with the conversion process.
Okay. Are there any other special protocols that, come into play quite often when you're helping people? Is there like a common thing that they're doing or not doing that's like preventing them from getting relief from the thyroid problems?
You mean as far as not from a symptom management standpoint, but like actually addressing the cause of the problem?
Yeah, I mean, are you able to identify causes, or maybe it doesn't matter, but the protocols you developed are like how efficacious are they? Do they, do most people get substantial relief, or are there a few tough cases that can't figure out what to do? Like, what does it look like, the landscape of the people you've helped?
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, most people do get relief and get good results. I mean, there's always going to be tough cookies who don't get the desired results. And I mean, sometimes it's hard to know if it's just because they're not compliant. I mean, obviously that's important, but then there are people who I work with who, say that they're doing everything, following all the recommendations, and they're not improving. And then that usually means we need to dig deeper because the thing is with both Graves and Hashimoto's, there could be, and usually are, multiple triggers. So if we do some initial testing, like for example, adrenal problems, I commonly recommend adrenal testing, as I mentioned, just because adrenal problems are common and there's different patterns. So we could assume someone has adrenal issue, but I like to see if someone has depressed cortisol levels or low cortisol levels. And if they have depressed cortisol levels, you ask about like protocol. So I would definitely, in either case, stress management's important. But when I had low cortisol, I took licorice root. There's things like desiccated adrenals. They're taking a B complex to support the adrenals. If someone has high cortisol, then we might want to give them some calming herbs to help with that, or things like relora, phosphatidylserine are some examples. And again, but on top of that, they very well might have other factors. Like, they might have H. pylori, which sometimes could be a factor, or they might have parasites, or they might have toxic mold. So we might find 2 or 3 things initially. And the person, like in my case, I only had some basic tests like adrenal testing, blood testing, nutrient testing, and that's all I needed. And I progressed for the most part with that. I hit a little bit of a roadblock, but didn't require comprehensive testing. But there, without question, are some people where we might be conservative and then ends up needing to do more testing just because they aren't progressing as expected. So I mean, there are, I would say, I guess you could say, basic protocols depending on the findings we see on, let's say, adrenal testing, or if someone has H. pylori and they want to address that naturally, then there's like an herbal protocol that I'd recommend for that, or parasites. I mean, I do give basic recommendations, like general recommendations, like an omega-3 fatty acid or fish oil for just about everybody. Probiotics, typically, I mean, vitamin D based on the labs, but most people are deficient in vitamin D. So there are definitely recommendations that I give the majority of people. And then there are also recommendations that are based on the the findings that we have on the test. And then, like I said, if we don't have all the answers, or even if we think we have all the answers and the person's not progressing, then we'll reevaluate, make sure that they're following the recommendations. And if they're not, obviously we're going to not do further testing, but tell them, hey, we need to, just be more strict with the diet, or make sure that you're blocking out time for stress management or whatever. If they're not taking the supplements, to do that. If they are following the recommendations, then we got to see what's missing, and it might mean retesting something that we already tested to see if we corrected the imbalance, or it might mean doing some further testing to see if there's anything else that we're missing.
Do thyroid issues usually accompany other autoimmune problems, or they stand alone? Like, how do they fit in with other autoimmune issues, lupus, et cetera?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that if you have one autoimmune condition, you're at increased risk of having other autoimmune conditions. So we do see increased prevalence of other autoimmune conditions, like, lupus. Yeah, that's not uncommon. I mean, celiac disease is pretty common. Some are more common than others, like multiple sclerosis. I can't say I see a lot of people with Graves and Hashimoto's with MS. I mean, I do see some, but again, it's not as common as some others. So celiac is pretty common. Rheumatoid arthritis, also kind of common. And then, yes, you mentioned lupus. That's also one of the more common ones. And then others like MS, Sjogren's disease, not as common. But without question, it is common to see multiple autoimmune conditions, and including what I also mentioned earlier. It's very common to have the antibodies for Hashimoto's and Graves. So we'll see, again, I'd say probably like 20-30% of people have the Graves antibodies, which are thyroid stimulating immunoglobulins, and then also have thyroid peroxidase. Actually, thyroid peroxidase is kind of like I don't want to say neutral antibody, more closely associated with Hashimoto's, but present in about 60-80% of people with Graves. So actually quite common with Graves. The thyroid globulin antibodies, those are more specific to Hashimoto's, and those probably we see like 20-30% of the time, along with the Graves antibodies. So getting back to the original question, no doubt we see a decent amount of people that have not just one, but multiple autoimmune conditions.
Right. Well, very good. What's a good resource for people to, start to understand what's going on with them? Whether they've been diagnosed with Graves or whatever it may be. I know you can't help everybody, but what's your recommendation to listeners that have some of these problems?
Yeah, well, definitely my podcast, SaveMyThyroid.com, where I have a little bit more of an emphasis on hyperthyroidism and Graves, just because most of the other podcasts focus on Hashimoto's. But I'd say that probably like 80% of the episodes will benefit both people with hyperthyroidism as well as those with Hashimoto's. And then my books. So you mentioned the books earlier, Natural Treatment Solutions for Hyperthyroidism and Graves' disease, the third edition, Hashimoto's Triggers, and the Hyperthyroid Healing Diet. So those are some good places to get started.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard. Appreciate this opportunity.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.